Washington Journal continues.
Welcome back for a check-in on the political news of the week. I'm joined by two of our regular guests, Lucy Caldwell, who is the founder of Mockingbird Labs. Welcome back, Lucy.
Hi, great to be with you.
And we also have Chet Love, who's the co-founder of the Cornerstone Group. Welcome back, Chet.
Thanks.
I want to start with the grim news that we received this morning about the two U.S. service members who were killed in Jordan as this conflict in Iran has escalated. There's been some recent polling on how the United States citizens are feeling about the conflict in Iran, with support of the conflict obviously very low. But in particular, 79% of the United States, of those polled, believe that the U.S. military actions in Iran are going to be going on for an extended period of time. Only 18% think the war will end quickly within weeks. The support for the U.S. strikes is low, only 37% approving of U.S. actions. And about half of the respondents in this Reuters Ipsos poll say that the war has been worth its costs, or think that about half of respondents think the war has not been worth its cost. Chet, I want to start with you. What does this mean for Republicans and the president, given how we're now seeing more deaths of U.S. service members and the collapse of the ceasefire?
Yeah, the Iran war has been a war abroad and also a war at home. It's been a very difficult challenge for President Trump because we went into the war with not a really clear idea of why we were going into this war. And it has essentially torn the Republican Party apart. There are a lot of Republicans right now that feel like this was not an America First war, that we are paying the price in terms of the America's blood and sweat and so many American soldiers that have been harmed or killed as a result of this war. And there's really not a clear win or a clear objective that we've achieved so far in terms of the war. And so I think what the president needs to be doing now, if I was sitting there advising him, is to continue to fight and to get out as quickly as possible. We saw the vice president on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about the work that he's doing in terms of trying to negotiate, but also the campaigns that have been coming against him in terms of trying to frustrate this ceasefire process. But nonetheless, I think despite the efforts of other countries to frustrate the process, we need to do everything we can to get out, because for Republicans, the continuing war is certainly a terrible situation.
Lucy, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, says on X, "Godspeed, heroes. Their sacrifice only stiffens our resolve." The oil prices have risen. President Trump is continuing to say that there will be further strikes. Iran's leaders are saying they're going to be pushing back. What do you see as the outlook for this, particularly as we are approaching the midterm elections?
Well, I think that we have to go back to Donald Trump's origin story, which is that he was a person who came down that golden escalator in 2015. And frankly, in some of his public posture even before that, and presented himself as the guy who was going to straight talk and be clear with the Republican base about what was and was not in their interest. And something that he made clear to them from his perspective at that time was not in their interest was endless foreign wars. And this, of course, is in the shadow, when we go back to that time, of September 11th, of the long protracted conflict in Iraq, in Afghanistan. And so he sold himself as a person who was going to speak truth to power to the neocons, to the war hawks, and that is not what Donald Trump's Republican Party would be about. Even now, he still clings on to this. He talks about himself as the president who's ended the most wars. This is a sort of like peacetime president, of a person who's looking out for Americans' interests at home. And that is a message that really spoke to many, many Americans. It really spoke to his base. It's part of why many in the Republican establishment were stunned by Donald Trump's rise in 2016. Democrats were stunned when he won in 2016. And he had his finger on the pulse about a few things about the American people. And he was connected with their feeling that this is not how they want Americans precious resources, whether it's our young men and women who are being sent off to war, or our tax dollars, our resources in general. And so I think that part of what's so problematic for him is that what has happened in the conflict in Iran is, in addition to the fact that there's just pretty obviously no strategy in place, and we could go back to Donald Trump's own personal feelings around President Obama's nuclear deal with Iran and how we got here. But in this moment, there seems to be no strategy in the war in Iran and no sign of getting out. And so it just really is fundamentally a big betrayal of his supporters. And it's a big betrayal of his supporters in a way that they feel the down home effects of at the gas pump, elsewhere. Of course, the tragedy of losing service members cannot be understated. And it is a feeling that they're having just a few months out from a pivotal midterm election. And so it certainly gives Democrats a chance to, I think, reclaim a stake around being the party of promoting peace, around being the party of avoiding endless foreign wars. And so I think we're seeing a real pivot that is certainly not good for Trump, and I think will cause ultimately a lot of his supporters to stay home. I don't think that they're about to become voters for high propensity Democratic voters, but I think a lot of them, for this reason, and of course others that I'm sure we'll talk about this morning, I think a lot of his supporters are just going to say, you know what, that's not what I signed up for, and no thank you, pass.
Speaking of elections, let's talk about President Trump's speech last Thursday night, where he warned about threats to election security and voting machines, foreign interference in U.S. elections. In this clip we're going to play, President Trump alleges that voting machines and ballot counting systems are vulnerable to attacks.
The third set of documents we are releasing proves that for many years, Americans were blatantly lied to about the security of our election infrastructure, including electronic voting machines and ballot counting systems, dishonest, almost all. They're vulnerable and they're easily compromised, and people within our government knew that. Tonight, we're publishing a series of previously classified U.S. intelligence community assessments and other reports proving that our government has long known these machines are extremely exposed to attack. As one assessment states, we judge that the United States adversaries, including at a minimum Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, as well as non-state groups, have the capability to compromise U.S. election infrastructure. That's unquote, but that's some statement, isn't it, made by supposedly great patriots of our country. The document goes on to further state that, quote, we assess that centralized election-related data repositories, such as voter registration databases, poll books, and other official election websites, are most vulnerable to exploitation, and adversaries could use this access to these systems to disrupt election processes within the United States of America. Tonight, we're releasing all of those findings, and spanning from January 2020 to June 2026. This is a cyber threat aimed at the very heart of our democracy.
Lucy, although many election experts have said that the evidence the president has presented does not support many of the claims that he raised in his speech, there was a Politico poll from last May indicating that both Democrats and Republicans are concerned about elections. Democrats are more concerned about voter intimidation and suppression, while Republicans are more worried about voter fraud. How do you think these overall concerns might impact voter turnout in the midterms?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, we have to look at the broader picture of what a state's relative mix is of mail-in voting versus in person. I think that it used to be in my day, when I was in a different life working on the Republican side of the aisle, Republicans actually used to be evangelists for mail-in voting, and Republicans were the ones who were voting early. They, of course, they wanted stronger checks on voter registration rolls in terms of things like voter ID and making sure to clean up the permanent early voting list with more regularity. But they were the early voters, and that has flipped. I think that in this moment, when I think Democrats and the American people in general are legitimately concerned about the sovereignty of elections and the ability of hardworking state and local election officials to carry out elections in a way that holds up the integrity of the process, and the specter of perhaps Trump administration officials sending ICE agents to nearby polling places, et cetera, I think that you will see perhaps, hopefully not, some reduction in turnout, but certainly a big push on the Democratic side for people to vote by mail and to vote early. And so I do think we'll see that. I want to address one thing that I think has not been explained clearly to people about one of the particularly pernicious claims that Trump was making in that speech, which is around this idea that foreign countries are accessing our voter registration rolls. And I heard that there was some discussion of that coming up among concerned callers in the last hour. One of the things that I think is lost in this, and it's part of what I think makes the way that Trump is talking about this so disingenuous, and Donald Trump himself may not even know this, but certainly his aides who are writing these speeches do, is that voter registration files are by and large a matter of public record. A campaign worker, a candidate campaign, even advocacy groups can often just go to a state and say, or a county and say, I'd like the voter roll of your last election, or your last 3 elections, or your last 10 elections, or what's your current voter registration. It has a lot of information. It has people's first and last name. It has how they are registered to vote. It will say if they showed up in a primary. And then on top of that, there's a whole, as part of the vast campaign consulting industrial complex and the era of a lot of money spent in politics, there are many companies that take those voter files, they consolidate them into a nationwide file, even though these individual files are built and maintained by state and local officials, and they append even more data onto that. And so for $100,000, you can go out and buy a nationwide voter file that has information that would certainly make, I think, a lot of people pretty uncomfortable that that's out there, right? First name, last name, email address, presence of children in your home, whether you're married, what your approximate income might be, whether you have a credit card, not how you voted in recent elections, but whether you show up to vote, whether you vote by mail, like that sort of thing, depending on the state. And there are very valid reasons for people to question how we should allow people to purchase voter data and how it's used. But it is just really important. I just really want to convey this. That is very different from a foreign actor accessing those files is exceptionally different than a massive cybersecurity hack. And I just want to put that distinction out there because we could have that discussion around voter data in general, but that's very, very important for people to understand what we're actually talking about here.
Something you mentioned earlier in your comment was that when you were a Republican, that mail-in voting in particular was something that had a lot of support on the right. And this is echoed by Representative Don Bacon, who's a Republican from Nebraska, who in reporting from the Hill said the biggest reason we Republicans lost, and this is referencing the 2020 election, was because he, Trump in this case, inhibited mail-in voting. He told Republicans don't do it. It wasn't fraud. The Democrats took advantage of it. We did not. The president said don't do it. And so I think it made a difference in 3 or 4 of those really tight elections. Chet, this relitigating of 2020, as well as this overall concern for election security, do you think that this is a compelling argument for Republicans today?
I don't think it's a compelling argument. And as a consultant, I deal with clients all the time, and I have some difficult clients who get so focused on a particular issue. And part of what your job is to do as a consultant is to help advise them in terms of seeing the bigger picture and really kind of focusing and shifting the narrative. And I think in this particular situation with the president, this is clearly a big issue for him. It's been something that he's continued to talk about for the last 6 years. But let me just say this emphatically. President Trump lost in 2020. Any Republican who cannot say that President Trump lost fair and square in 2020, I just don't think should be a credible person to talk about this. And I can say this as a Republican who's worked with a lot of these think tanks in D.C., who's actually looked into these issues specifically around the country. I chaired a nonprofit, Republican nonprofit that was working on a lot of these issues as well. So there's not massive voter fraud going on around the country. But to be fair to the president, I think that a lot of the things that he did raise in his speech were actually, in fact, true. If people actually spent the time to look at the NIC reports, what they will see is, yes, China did, in fact, have a hack. They didn't go out and buy this information simply off the internet or from the States. There was security breaches. Yes, the NIC did identify particular security breaches in some of the electronic voting. Now, they did not identify that there was any ballots that were changed or votes that were changed. In fact, the NIC reports have specifically stated that the idea of a massive voting fraud, of changing votes, would be extremely difficult, and that's identified specifically in that 2020 report. So again, I think that the president is trying to muddy the waters here, unfortunately, and I think that his advisors should be advising him to switch, to be able to focus on other wins. I mean, we just had the bipartisan passing of housing legislation that I think would have been fantastic for the president to sign, but unfortunately he did not, because he was still upset about the fact that the SAVE Act has not passed. And so I think his advisors need to help him refocus, because in order for Republicans to win in this midterm, we have to get the poll numbers up, and we have to be talking about positive wins instead of having this rhetoric around an election that happened over 6 years ago.
We have our phone lines open. If you have questions for Republican strategist Chet Love or Democratic strategist Lucy Caldwell, our phone line for Democrats is 202-748-8000. For Republicans, 202-748-8001. And for Independents, 202-748-8002. We'll start with Mary in Prentice, Mississippi, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Mary.
Yes,
Mary, just please make sure to turn down the volume on your television and then go ahead with your questions for Chet or Lucy.
Okay. Why won't y'all get that man out the White House? He's a criminal. He had our national secrets, 7 to other countries. You can't make a god out of mountain or molehill. Get him out of there. Pick somebody. If you want to make a god out of somebody, let him be upstanding. A good person like Barack Obama was. Excellent choice. And for them, I want to stop the line on Joe Biden. It was a show on TV in the 70s called Schoolhouse Rock. I'm telling y'all. Joe Biden didn't open the floodgates. We invited them people over here way in the 70s, put the Statue of Liberty in the New York Harbor and told the people to come to America. They say we was the greatest melting pot. Look it up and look in the archive. We was the greatest melting pot in the world. So please get out and vote in November. You grown, vote the way you want to, but remember there's repercussions and backlash and things you have to pay for if you put the wrong person in there. Thanks for taking my call, baby.
Chet, I wonder if you want to respond to Mary's point about who Republicans should actually be putting forward as the leader of the party.
Well, yeah, I think what the caller said, it was great. She said, you're adults and you choose to vote for who you want to vote for. And in fact, the American people in the election, which was a free and fair election in 2024, voted in President Trump. And it was a resounding vote. I mean, there's so many states around the country that voted for the president. And so I think what we are going to continue to see for the Republican Party as we look forward into the midterms and then look forward into 2028 is going to be continuing to put up candidates that are American first candidates that are concerned about America, that can address the issues of the American people, and that's what's going to be competitive, because what we need to have in this country are continue to have free and fair elections and to be able to allow the American people to choose.
Kelly is in Clemens, North Carolina, on our line for Republicans. Good morning, Kelly.
Hi, it's good to have you back. I just wanted to say that I don't know, I've not seen it on your show or any time that I watch, and I watch every morning, that there was a case from Dominion against Mike Lindell, the pillow
Dominion
guy.
Voting Systems, yes.
Uh-huh. And Dominion, the company, recently, which is overseas, recently was found out. And they found out that they have been messing with or have messed with a long time ago, and they've been that way since, all their Dominion voting machines with a I'm not exactly sure
So,
what
Kelly,
all the
if
details.
you don't mind if I pause you for a moment, because I did see some recent reporting related to Dominion Voting Systems and Mike Lindell. And if you don't mind, I'll just read that so we can get everybody up to date. This is reporting from ABC News, but it's been widely reported elsewhere that the voting machine company has settled a $1 billion defamation suit against Mike Lindell. It comes 8 months after it was purchased by a former GOP election official. So the voting machine company, formerly known as Dominion Voting Systems, on Wednesday, this is from a couple weeks ago, ended its billion-dollar defamation lawsuit against Trump ally Mike Lindell 8 months after the company was purchased by a former Republican election official. In a statement, a spokesperson for the company, now called Liberty Vote, said the parties have agreed to a confidential settlement to this matter. Dominion sued Lindell, the CEO of MyPillow, in 2021 for $1.3 billion, claiming he pushed false conspiracy theories about the 2020 election despite knowing they were lies. Voting systems made by Dominion, one of the most used voting machine companies in the U.S., were used in 27 states during the 2024 election. Dominion was sold in October to a company run by Scott Leidendecker, whose LinkedIn profile says he served as the election director for the city of St. Louis until 2012. News articles from the time indicate he is a Republican. So, Kelly, I'm guessing this is the story that you were referencing, so you can go ahead with your question.
Okay. What paper is that?
This is from ABC News, but it's been reported in several other places, including the Minnesota Post, the Star Tribune. It's in a variety of outlets. It's been widely reported.
Okay. If I were y'all, I'd look into that deeper. But anyways, look at the actual documents from the court. But what I wanted to say was, now he doesn't have to worry about that. Now, as far as China, yes, they were getting those voter rolls, and they were using them to make licenses. If you look at the documents that Trump put out with his speech the other night, you will see that they were using them to make licenses, and they were being given with the proper picture of whoever was going to get this license, and they were paid to do it, and they would send them over, and they were actually caught some up north in, I believe they caught some in Chicago a while back, and they caught some in another state, and I can't remember that one at this moment. But so what Mike Lindell was saying at that time, because I watched him, was true. And so anyway, and the stuff that Trump's been saying about it is true. And in none of the calls from the poll people.
Kelly, I want to give our guests a chance to respond. Lucy, I haven't seen that the president actually said anything about, or that the document said anything about creating licenses from that China information. He did reference in his speech that some of the television stations that chose not to air his speech, he wanted their licenses to be reviewed. But I wonder if you can respond broadly, Lucy, to some of Kelly's comments.
Yeah, I was trying to piece together some of this because I do want to say pretty unequivocally, I believe that even in the reports that Donald Trump is promoting in conjunction with his speech this week, there is no evidence that China did implement something like that. And I also want to underscore that the data that we are talking about that China accessed, it's actually also not entirely clear how they accessed some of that voter data. Some of it was stuff that they probably were pulling down from states that make the voter roll available online to anyone who downloads it. Maybe there was some hacking in some places. Perhaps they were, and I think very likely, buying commercial data, because I think that what we're really talking about actually is a foreign interference campaign in the form of paid persuasion, right? Of trying to change hearts and minds and influence how people voted. But there is no evidence even across that, even if you have the darkest read of that situation. There is not evidence that they were accessing sensitive data associated with people's private information, a la PII, like social security number, that sort of thing. There was, I remember that seeing something about an FBI memo around a claim that China was planning to use fraudulent driver's licenses to account for, tens of thousands of mail-in votes around 2020, and I think that is part of what Donald Trump is referencing. But again, that is a claim that has not been backed up. It was just a debate, I think, internally, and there is New York Times reporting about this that I just glanced at because I was trying to remind myself of what you might be talking about. There was debate about whether or not this was a claim that I think should go into this report, but it was generally unfounded. And so there is not evidence that there was any widespread ID making scheme. That also, I think, unclear how that would even work or even be efficient, even if bad actors were doing that. I think it's great that everyone cares about having integrity in our elections. We should be clear about what is and is not happening. And I think your idea of going to primary source documents, Kelly, and things like the Mike Lindell civil litigation with Dominion, it's always great to go to those primary source documents. And so I think to the degree that you're able to go look at that NIC report that Donald Trump referenced, look at that February 2020 FBI memo, those primary source documents may be very useful as well. There's also a Heritage Foundation database that I specifically mentioned that because Heritage is certainly not associated with the left. It's very strongly associated with the right, where they keep a database of cases of election fraud. And I think it goes decades back, and they've tracked like less than 2,000 or something, but you can actually go into each one and look at the details.
Last hour, and it goes back to 2017, and they found 138 cases.
Right. Thank you. Perfect.
And that New York Times reporting that you're referring, which I'm guessing is what Kelly was actually talking about, is the headline is Assessing the Documents, Fake IDs from China. A previously released FBI memo viewed skeptically by intelligence agents described a purported scheme by China to meddle in the 2020 election. And so that is probably what Kelly was referencing. Let's go to Shirley in Conyers, Georgia, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Shirley.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I'm calling actually. I was trying to reach in a previous segment about the SAVE Act that Trump is proposing. My question is that to say that, well, first I remember a rally that I watched that he was having, and he said specifically that if we get this passed, if we, in other words, hold the House, we would never have to have another election again. We would never have to worry about this. Is this what's influencing the voters now who really weary of the elections and the distrust of what could possibly happen in elections? That's a question. Another thing is that I hear people say that, well, I use my ID to get on a plane, we all need an ID. I know I've always used an ID, and in this case, I use my driver's license from my state, a driver's license given to me, and this uses my ID. When I applied for a passport years ago, I needed my birth certificate. So now with the SAVE Act is passed, does that mean that all of the states, is this the purpose of having the SAVE Act, is that all of the states would have to be under one rule, and now we do not know what those are. We don't know what we will need it, because what's required in Georgia might not be required in California or vice versa. And my question is that if the SAVE Act is passed, does that mean that all the states have the same requirements, and now we don't even know what the requirements are? So now I hear people saying that, I've been able to use my get on the plane.
So Shirley, I'm going to have Chet respond to these 2 points that you've raised. The first, the idea that the president said that if the SAVE Act passes, that we wouldn't need another election. And then this second idea, Chet, of whether there would be a national standard then for voter identification and whether those rules would be clear.
So I would say, as a lawyer, the voting belongs to the states, and so there will not be a national standard when it comes to voting, because the Constitution makes it clear that voting belongs to the states, and so each state will have its own standard when it comes to voting. The federal government certainly has a certain influence in terms of the states, in terms of money and resources, et cetera, to influence how they choose to operate, sort of similar to the highway system. But by and large, the standards would still remain at the states. But I think what we need to make clear is that the idea around the SAVE Act, there's a lot of different provisions in the SAVE Act at large. I think the number one issue that a lot of people are looking at is requiring individuals to have an ID to vote, which I certainly support and I think is a great idea. But I believe it needs to be coupled with making it easier to access getting an ID and also increasing voter participation. Because I think the messaging from a strategy perspective that I would say as a conservative is what we need to do is to demystify this issue or misunderstanding that Republicans simply don't want people to vote, and that the idea around getting a voter ID is somehow trying to limit people from voting. And so I think that could be a really great thing. But I do think that, in terms of trying to protect elections and be concerned about these things, again, I do want to take a moment just to reiterate the fact that, in these declassified reports, in fairness to the president, it was clear that the IC community basically said that China did engage in certain levels of espionage, and they did certainly get access to public information, but they were engaged in cyber attacks, and they did get access to a certain amount of PII. And so I think that while we do need to, I don't think the SAVE Act is a legislation that should be something that we should be focusing on in 2026. I do think that continuing to make sure that America protects itself from foreign actors who are trying to do these influence campaigns are certainly something that we all can be aligned with.
What about the president's statements about the future of voting?
Yeah, I think that was more rhetorical. I certainly think that, look, I understand there's a lot of people and a lot of rhetoric that have gone out, that people have said Donald Trump's not going to leave office, that Donald Trump wants to be a dictator and take over America. But again, people don't believe in that. Republicans don't believe in that. Everybody believes in the rule of law. And at the end of the day, even though Donald Trump didn't believe in the election results clearly in 2020, he still left office. So there's still a process in America, no matter what rhetoric you may hear on the internet, that in 2028 we're going to have a new president. President Trump certainly cannot run again unless there's a constitutional change. So we're going to have a new president sworn in January of 2029.
We have a question via text from Barb in Long Grove, Illinois, who says, what are the speaker's views on the recent Democratic Socialist Party primary victories? This actually came up last week on Washington Journal when the Democratic Socialists of America co-chair Ashik Sadiq responded to a viewer question about the Democratic Socialists of America platform, including a provision that calls for the abolition of the U.S. Senate.
Part of what you said, for example, let's start with abolishing the Senate. The Senate is a very undemocratic institution. I talked a bit about democracy, small d democracy, and that's really important to us. We want democratic representation of all people who live in this country. So the Senate represents, it's 2 senators per state, and it's very undemocratic at a basic level because a state with a small population has the same representation as a state that has 500,000 people gets the same representation as a state that has 40 million people, like California does, or New York State, or Texas, or Florida, which are the most populated states in the country, but they have the same representation as a much smaller population. So we do believe that government should be proportional to the population, and that's a very basic core principle. So the House of Representatives is more democratic that way. And we just don't see the point of the Senate. Historically, it was meant to serve very wealthy people who owned a lot of land. And that's still a system that we have today. And it's something we would change. We would expand what the House of Representatives does and make it more actually representative of people who live in this country.
So would you like to abolish the Senate?
That's part of our platform, and we don't think that's extreme. We think it's a change that would help make this country more democratic.
Lucy, I wonder if you can respond to Barb's question about the recent Democratic Socialist Party primary victories.
Sure. Well, certainly I think that that the clip you played is takes one aback, right? And I don't think that campaigning on abolishing the Senate is going to be a winning strategy for the DSA. That said, I think that the recent DSA victories in primaries, I think it reflects 2 things. One is structural. One is the fact that primaries are not very reflective of the general electorate. And I'm a big fan of the democracy reform efforts, structural reform efforts to remake our primaries so that they actually are more representative of the voter base, because something like 10% of eligible voters, are able to vote in primaries, and then they choose 2 candidates who in many cases end up being nominees, a Republican and a Democrat, who are very out of step with how most people feel, right? They're in step with what the very activated core base of the primary wanted and felt. So I will say that, for example, I don't think that we can extrapolate big things from primary outcomes, except that, in any given primary outcome, one party or another may fare better based on whether or not they've actually done a good job of electing or nominating, a candidate who will fare well in the general election. The second piece that I do want to mention, though, is I think that part of why you're seeing some of the DSA success is because they are tapping into something that the Democratic Party has not been able to tap into more broadly. And it, I think, relates also to why the Democratic Party has had trouble combating Trumpism. And I think it's that we are in a uniquely populist moment. The idea of things like the tech oligarchy, right? Like that resonates with people, and people feel as though they're being left behind. And so it's that is something that Trump tapped into. It's something that MAGA has tapped into. I find the MAGA form of populism particularly toxic, but I think that many in the Democratic establishment, and populism, not my natural politics, I should say, that's not like what I gravitate to, but I think we are in a populist moment. And I think that the Democratic Party has to assess that and accept that and begin elevating populist figures who have a pro-democracy, healthy form of populist politics, or they will otherwise be swept away in a tsunami of toxic populism and of toxic MAGA populism. So I think that some of the success of DSA candidates reflects the fact that voters, in this case Democratic primary voters, feel like they're speaking to them in ways that the Democratic establishment does not. That the Democratic establishment is just a bunch of Acela corridor rich folks who are out of touch with their own lived experiences.
And Chet, what's your take on the victories of DSA candidates in primaries?
Well, number one, I think most people in this country don't understand what the DSA platform is. I think Lucy's right in the sense that a lot of people are just frustrated with the general process in this country, and so they're looking for any opportunity or option. But the reality is that these candidates and their platform are pushing the party further to the left. I mean, what we've seen now, the Democrats was defund the police, and now you have places like Portland that are decrying the fact that they don't have enough police officers, and it takes 45 minutes for the police to arrive at a location. You have Mondami in New York freezing rents, and that's going to have disastrous effects on citizens. So I think at the end of the day, we've seen these type of movements. I've said this before. You go back, harken back to the '60s. You have the SDS movement around, the democratic socialism, and it fails. It fails every single time because at the end of the day, it's a lot of talk. It's a lot of ideas, but when it comes to actually delivering to the American people, there's really just not a lot there. So I think that it's a very dangerous thing for the Democrats because as that wing of the party grows, you have AOC, you have Bernie Sanders, you have Mondami, you have so many others that are really growing in that party. So it's something not to ignore. It's something to take very seriously. And I think we're going to see that reflected in the midterms, where you're going to have more extreme liberal candidates on the Democratic side that are going to be the face of the party.
Roseanne is in San Diego, California, on our line for Democrats. Good morning, Roseanne.
Good morning. I have a couple of things. One thing I would say, though, is that the Democratic Socialists are a minority. New York, Vermont do not speak for the whole country, and I think this was just a scare tactic and something the media is hyping up because it's, makes for good headlines. So I don't think that's even a problem. I don't live in New York. Mondami's not going to hurt me. But anyway, what I really wanted to talk to you guys about is to see what you think about what Mark Wayne Mullen said yesterday. I think it was yesterday when he said they're going to check every single voting roll.
It was on Friday. He made that press conference. Yes, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary.
Yeah, and he's going to look at every single one to make sure there's not a single illegal alien voting there. How is he going to possibly do that? That is so dangerous.
So, Roseanne, just because we're a little bit short on time, I'm just going to have both of our guests quickly respond to that question before we wrap. Go ahead, Lucy.
Sure. I mean, to be brief, obviously that's a ridiculous thing for Mark Wayne Mullen to be saying, and it's not a legitimate inquiry, but it is part of the broader tactic by this Republican Party and the Trump administration to foment distrust in election results and to foment distrust of hardworking state and local election officials who are doing their job and doing it with deep integrity. And it is a way to create the scaffolding to allow Donald Trump and his allies to exercise their option after blistering midterm losses to question legitimacy of this election and to do tomfoolery that is really anti-democratic, like perhaps not seating new members of the House, etc. So it is all political theater, but it's political theater that is designed to foment distrust in our elections, which are frankly the cornerstone of our democracy, and it's very shameful.
Chet?
What I would encourage the president and the White House and Mark Wayne Mullen is to continue to stay on message and continue to stay on topic. Again, this issue around voting and voting rolls has been a huge distraction when the American people's real focus was protecting the border and dealing with the issue of deporting people who in this country who are undocumented. At this point today, in President Trump's term, in his second term, Barack Obama has still deported more undocumented people than President Trump has. And so we need to be spending our time to really focus on delivering on the promises that we made to the American people. And that needs to be our focus, and not get distracted by these issues that really are not major issues.
Republican strategist Chet Love and Democratic strategist Lucy Caldwell, thank you both for joining us again.